December 21, 1945. The phone call came to Dwight Eisenhower's office in Washington. George Patton was dead. For 3 years, Eisenhower had walked a tightrope, publicly disciplining his most effective general while privately depending on him to win battles no one else could win. He defended Patton to politicians, apologized for him to allies, and restrained him when his aggression threatened to create diplomatic disasters. Now, Patton was gone, and for the first time since the war began, Eisenhower didn't have to measure his words. What he said in the weeks and months that followed revealed a truth he'd buried under layers of political necessity. Patton wasn't just a good general, he was irreplaceable, and losing him felt like losing the war's most effective weapon. If you want to hear what Eisenhower really thought when he didn't have to be diplomatic anymore, subscribe right now. Before there was a supreme commander and a subordinate general, there were 2 young officers who understood each other perfectly. Camp Meade, 1919. Eisenhower and Patton were both captains in the newly formed Tank Corps. They'd spend hours tearing down engines, debating tactics, imagining how mechanized warfare would change everything. Patton was the wealthy aristocrat, old family money, supreme confidence, already a combat veteran from Mexico and France. Eisenhower was the Kansas farm boy who'd missed combat in World War I and was still trying to prove himself. But they connected over a shared vision. Tanks weren't just support vehicles, they were the future of warfare. Fast, mobile, devastating when used correctly. The Army disagreed, shut down their ideas, threatened their careers if they kept pushing. Patton, with his family wealth, could afford to be defiant. Eisenhower, who needed his paycheck, learned to be more careful with his words. 23 years later, those 2 captains had become the supreme Allied commander in Europe and the most feared general in the American Army. The friendship remained, but everything else had changed. Eisenhower now had to manage Patton, had to harness his aggression, had to explain his controversies to Roosevelt, to Churchill, to Marshall, had to decide when to unleash him and when to hold him back. And Patton? Patton resented being managed. He thought Eisenhower had become too political, too cautious, too concerned with diplomacy and coalition building. He wanted to fight, not negotiate. The tension between them simmered throughout the war. 2 men who'd once been equals, now locked in a relationship where one had the vision and the other had the power to execute it or to stop it. August 1943, Sicily. Patton was commanding the 7th Army in the invasion of Italy. He visited field hospitals and encountered soldiers suffering from what we'd now call PTSD, then called combat fatigue or shell shock. Patton saw them as cowards. In 2 separate incidents, he slapped soldiers, called them names, threatened to shoot them. Word got out. Journalists heard about it. Politicians demanded answers. The public was outraged. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: fire Patton and lose his best combat commander, or keep him and risk a political firestorm. Eisenhower chose a middle path. He issued a formal reprimand. He ordered Patton to apologize to the soldiers, to the medical staff, to his entire army. He made it public enough to satisfy critics, but stopped short of ending Patton's career. Why? Because Eisenhower was already planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, and he knew he needed Patton for it. Not wanted, needed. In Sicily, Patton had proven what Eisenhower suspected. He moved faster, hit harder, and demoralized the enemy more effectively than any other American commander. His 7th Army had raced across Sicily, while Montgomery's British forces moved methodically. The Germans learned to fear Patton's speed and unpredictability. So Eisenhower saved Patton's career, but it came at a cost. Eisenhower had to defend the decision to Marshall, to Roosevelt, to the War Department. He had to promise that Patton would be controlled, that it wouldn't happen again, that the military benefit outweighed the political cost. And here's what Eisenhower could never say publicly. he wasn't entirely sure Patton was wrong. In private conversations with his staff, Eisenhower expressed frustration with soldiers who broke down under pressure. He didn't condone Patton's actions, but he understood the mindset. In war, you need men who can endure. Patton's method of handling it was wrong, but his instinct that armies need discipline and mental toughness wasn't entirely off base. Eisenhower just couldn't say that, so he reprimanded Patton publicly and protected him privately.
Spring 1944. D-Day was approaching. Eisenhower faced a crucial problem, convincing the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. The solution was Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception involving fake armies, fake radio traffic, fake installations. And at the center of it all, George Patton. The Germans believed Patton was the most dangerous Allied commander. They'd studied his North Africa and Sicily campaigns. They knew he was aggressive, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. German intelligence was obsessed with tracking his location. So Eisenhower used that obsession. He put Patton in command of the fictitious First Army Group, supposedly preparing to invade Calais. Patton gave speeches, inspected fake units, appeared at fake bases. German reconnaissance photographed inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft. And the Germans bought it. They kept major forces at Calais for weeks after D-Day, convinced that Patton's real invasion was still coming. It worked brilliantly, but it drove Patton insane. He wanted to be in the first wave at Normandy. He wanted to fight, not play actor for a phantom army. He felt humiliated being used as bait while other generals earned glory on the beaches. Eisenhower couldn't tell him the full truth, that Patton was more valuable as a deception than as a commander in those crucial early weeks, that his reputation was literally saving Allied lives by keeping German divisions away from Normandy. Patton only learned the full scope of Operation Fortitude after the war, and even then he resented it. But Eisenhower knew what he was doing. He was using Patton's greatest asset, his fearsome reputation, to win battles before they were even fought. August 1st, 1944. Patton's Third Army finally became operational in France. What followed was the most spectacular advance in modern military history. In 1 month, the Third Army advanced further than any comparable force had ever moved. They liberated hundreds of French towns and cities. They destroyed or captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. They moved so fast that German commanders couldn't establish defensive lines before Patton smashed through them. Eisenhower watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride because Patton was proving everything they'd theorized back in 1919 about mobile warfare. Anxiety because Patton was moving so fast he was outrunning his supply lines and creating coordination problems with other Allied armies. The other commanders couldn't keep up. Bradley was methodical and careful. Montgomery was even slower, refusing to attack until every detail was perfect. But Patton just moved. He'd call Eisenhower's headquarters demanding more fuel, more ammunition. "Give me the supplies and I'll be in Berlin in 2 weeks," he'd say. Eisenhower would have to explain that it wasn't that simple. Other armies needed supplies too. Political considerations mattered. The Soviets had agreements about occupation zones. Patton didn't care about any of that. He saw the German army crumbling and wanted to finish them before they could recover. Every day of delay, in Patton's mind, was wasted opportunity. And privately, Eisenhower sometimes agreed. In conversations with his chief of staff, Bedell Smith, Eisenhower would admit that Patton had a point, that maybe they were being too cautious, that maybe politics was interfering with military logic. But as supreme commander, Eisenhower had to think about military effectiveness. He had to manage an alliance of nations with competing interests. He had to balance American, British, and Soviet priorities. He had to think about the post-war world, not just winning the current battle. So he held Patton back, diverted supplies to Montgomery for Market Garden, which failed spectacularly, made Patton slow down, consolidate, coordinate with other forces. Patton was furious, thought Eisenhower was wasting the best chance to end the war. Their relationship, already strained, became openly hostile at times. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. The Germans launched a massive surprise attack, the Battle of the Bulge. American forces were caught completely unprepared. Entire units were surrounded. The front lines collapsed. For the first time since D-Day, it looked like the Allies might actually lose ground. Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun. His top commanders gathered to figure out how to respond. The mood was grim. Bradley looked shaken. Montgomery was being his usual cautious self. Other generals were talking about defensive positions and waiting for reinforcements. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George, how long will it take you to attack?" Everyone in the room understood the magnitude of what Eisenhower was asking. Patton's Third Army was 90 degrees away from the Bulge, engaged in offensive operations to the south. To help, he'd have to completely disengage, pivot his entire army, 3 divisions, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and attack through winter weather into the German flank. The logistics were staggering. Most commanders would need weeks. Patton pulled out a small notebook. He'd already wargamed this scenario during the train ride to Verdun. He looked at Eisenhower and said, "December 22nd, 3 divisions." 72 hours. Other generals in the room thought it was impossible. Bradley looked skeptical, but Eisenhower knew Patton well enough to know he wasn't bluffing. "Make it so," Eisenhower said. Patton delivered. On December 22nd, exactly when he promised, 3 divisions of the Third Army slammed into the German southern flank. The attack blunted the German offensive and turned the Battle of the Bulge from a potential disaster into an Allied victory. This was the moment when everything Eisenhower had endured managing Patton paid off. All the controversies, all the diplomatic headaches, all the times he'd had to defend Patton or restrain him or apologize for him. It was all worth it for this moment. Because when the crisis came, when everything was falling apart, Eisenhower turned to Patton, and Patton delivered what no one else could.
During the war, Eisenhower's public statements about Patton were always carefully calibrated, complimentary but measured, acknowledging his contributions without elevating him above other commanders. Eisenhower couldn't show favoritism. He commanded an alliance, not just an army. He had to keep Montgomery happy, keep Bradley confident, maintain morale across all units. Publicly calling Patton irreplaceable would have been a diplomatic disaster. But privately, Eisenhower knew the truth. In staff meetings, when discussing operational plans, Eisenhower would often ask, "What would Patton do?" Not because Patton was always right, but because Patton thought differently than everyone else. While other commanders saw obstacles, Patton saw opportunities. While others calculated risks, Patton calculated how fast he could move. Eisenhower's diary entries from 1944 and 1945 reveal his frustration with this contradiction. He needed Patton's aggression, but had to restrain it. He valued Patton's results, but had to apologize for his methods. He relied on Patton in crisis, but couldn't admit it publicly. The war ended, and Patton became a liability overnight. His comments about Nazi party members caused a scandal. His calls to fight the Soviets were politically toxic. The qualities that made him effective in war made him dangerous in peace. Eisenhower had to remove him from command. It was one of the hardest decisions he ever made, demoting his old friend, the general who'd saved the day at the Bulge, the man who'd proven every theory they'd developed together back in 1919. Their last conversations were strained, bitter. Patton felt betrayed. Eisenhower felt he had no choice. Then came the car accident, and 12 days later, Patton was gone. After Patton's death, Eisenhower's carefully maintained diplomatic mask cracked. In letters to friends, in conversations with staff members, in private moments documented by those around him, Eisenhower spoke with a raw honesty he'd never allowed himself during the war. He admitted that Patton could achieve results through sheer speed, pressure, and force of personality, traits that couldn't be taught, couldn't be replicated. Other generals commanded through planning and organization. Patton commanded through willpower alone. Eisenhower said that restraining Patton had been necessary for political reasons, not military ones. That some of his decisions to hold Patton back haunted him.
that maybe if he'd given Patton more freedom, the war would have ended sooner. He admitted that Patton thrived in chaos and uncertainty, the exact conditions where other commanders froze. When everything was going wrong, when decisions had to be made instantly, Patton was at his best. And Eisenhower said something that revealed the core of their relationship. Managing Patton had been the hardest part of his command, but also the most important. Because Patton needed management. Left unchecked, he would have created diplomatic disasters and political chaos, but properly directed, he was unstoppable. In his memoirs written years later, Eisenhower called Patton indispensable to the effort. That's an extraordinary word, indispensable. It means irreplaceable. It means the outcome would have been different without him. Eisenhower wrote that Patton was uniquely suited for war, but impossible to manage in peace. He didn't mean it as criticism. He meant it as recognition that some people are built for specific circumstances. Patton was built for war, for speed, for aggression, for breaking enemies through relentless pressure. In peacetime, those qualities had nowhere to go. They became liabilities instead of assets. Eisenhower became president in 1953. He led America for 8 years, navigating the dangerous early Cold War period. He never fought another war, never commanded another army, but he never forgot Patton. In interviews late in life, Eisenhower would still talk about him, about their friendship at Camp Meade, about the impossible decisions he'd faced managing him during the war, about the Battle of the Bulge and that moment when he needed someone who could do the impossible. The admission Eisenhower made after Patton died wasn't just about one general. It was about the burden of command, about the loneliness of having to restrain people you need, about the gap between what's militarily effective and what's politically acceptable. Eisenhower had been forced to manage genius, to protect Patton from himself and from others, to balance his value against his controversies. And only after Patton was gone could Eisenhower admit how much it had cost him and how much it had been worth it. America lost more than a general on December 21, 1945. It lost someone who could make impossible things happen through sheer force of will, someone who thrived when everything was falling apart, someone uniquely suited for the chaos of war. Eisenhower knew it. He'd always known it. But only after Patton died could he finally say it without consequences. Do you think Eisenhower should have given Patton more freedom, or was he right to restrain him? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold truths from history's greatest friendships and rivalries, subscribe now. See you next time.